So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about how decisions have consequences. How decisions have consequences. And they all do, don't they? When we think about every decision that we make in our lives, there is a result that happens from that decision. That's a consequence. And there are good consequences. There are bad consequences. We're going to talk about some bad ones today, about some things that we can learn from other people in the Bible, and how we can not make those same mistakes. Because we all have feelings and emotions, don't we? Sometimes we speak before we think, or act before we consider the impact of our decisions. And today, what we're going to talk about primarily is somebody in the Bible, actually Peter, and how he made a bunch of decisions that had some negative consequences, but also how he continued to press on all just the same, and actually is an encouraging person for us to look at. So we're gonna kind of go through a lot of what Peter did and learn from it, and maybe get a little bit of encouragement from it also. Sometimes we lose our tempers, and sometimes we say things that are hurtful, something that we don't really mean, something that is said in the heat of the moment, in anger. Sometimes we accuse people of doing things even though they're not the person that did them. Like, where did you put my keys? More likely, where did I put my keys, right? So, when I was a fraud investigator, something that I used to think that was really funny is I would come up to a house and knock on the door, and they wanted to know who ratted them out or who turned them in, right? And they would tell me, I bet it was so-and-so because they hate me for this reason. I bet it was this person here. And they'd go through and they'd tell you all these people. And I would just sit there and just write down all these names. And then I would call them up and say, what do you have to say about so-and-so? Because all of those people would be wrong. Sometimes I would get 4 or 5 extra witnesses for a case sometimes because of that. So sometimes we don't think about what we're actually saying when we say it and the consequences of those actions. Sometimes we get ourselves to maybe gossiping, or also called backbiting. Envy or spite can lead us to say intentionally spurious things, just like things that aren't true, things that are mean. Sometimes we don't really think before we act, and we say things that are maybe seemingly more benign, like giving bad worldly advice that maybe that you would see on your on late night television, or something that's worldly that people would generally be fine, but as a Christian, not really good advice that we should give. And I think that's because a lot of times we're just steeped in all of this culture around us, and it sometimes skews what's important to God. Sometimes it skews how God wants us to live. But anyway, one thing that we definitely need to keep in mind in all the interactions that we have is that our actions do have consequences, and that we can identify making people that make rash decisions, or we can learn from people that make rash decisions. And in the Bible, we have somebody that makes a lot of rash decisions, and that's Peter. That's a Rembrandt, actually, of Peter. I didn't know Rembrandt was that old, but that's what he thinks that he looks like anyway. But I want to talk about what we can learn from Peter. But before we do that, we got to look at some of the things that Peter did. If we look at John 13, 8 through 10, it says, Peter said to him, "Never shall you wash my feet." Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you have no part with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, then wash not only my feet, but my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "He who has bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean, and you are clean, but not all of you." And of course, not all of you refers to Judas Iscariot. But Peter here, what's he do? He presumes to know what's best. He bristles at the thought of Jesus washing his feet. And he totally misses the point that Jesus is trying to make about serving others. Had Peter waited and allowed Jesus to teach him, then he wouldn't have had to get embarrassed and been rebuked, right? Or having to been corrected. So let's keep taking a look at some of the other things that Peter did here. So Matthew 16:21 through 23, it says, "From that time Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and be raised up on the third day." Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. So, rebuking Jesus, right? Saying, "God forbid it, Lord. This shall never happen to you." But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are not setting your mind on God's interest, but on man's interest." So what's going on here? Peter reacts again without really thinking, right? He presumes to know that he knows better than Jesus about what's best for Jesus. He thinks he knows what's correct, so he actually rebukes him. He's like, "No." Take him aside, "You're wrong," right? And in his rebuke, he tempts Jesus, doesn't he, with thoughts of preserving his own life. Because, Jesus doesn't want to go to the cross, right? Even in the Garden of Gethsemane, he says, "If it be your will, let this cup pass from me." So Jesus is not excited about being crucified. And he even knows what's going to happen to him back here. And so Peter takes him aside and says, "God forbid it, Lord." So that's appealing to his pride. That's appealing to fear. And in the process, Jesus identifies Peter as a servant of Satan, right? Due to his carnal and unspiritual attitude, not thinking about what's best in God's interest and only thinking about what's best for man's interest. So that's what he does. That's what he does there. We're not going to do every single thing that Peter ever did, because there's quite a few of them. But we're going to keep going through a few more. Matthew 26:35. He famously says, this is at the end, right? This is before Jesus is crucified. Right before that, he says, "Even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you." And all the disciples said the same thing too. But as we know, that's not what happens. The next day, Peter rejected Jesus not once, not twice, but 3 times. And then he hears the crowing, right? Like just as Jesus said. And and he goes away crying, and then he has an awkward reunification on a beach sometime later, right? Where he expresses that he loves Jesus not once, not twice, but 3 times. So Jesus is reminding him, this is what you did. It was not good that you rejected me 3 times. So he asks him if you love me 3 times. And of course, Jesus knows that in his heart that he does. But it was another rash decision that Peter made because he was afraid. So in the moment, Peter was afraid. He says, "No, I don't even know that guy. Whoever he is, I've never seen him before, not a moment in my life." And yet he had said this thing, "Even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you." So again, just rash decisions, making bad decisions. I think that it's also, this particular thing is also in contrast to the way that Judas acted, though, later on. Judas killed himself for betraying Jesus. But it is an example to all of us that God will forgive anybody of anything, even by betraying him. Even those that reject him and betray him, if they seek forgiveness and they want back with Jesus, and he's happy to have them back, because he was happy to have Peter back. Really happy to have Peter back, even though Peter had denied him. So let's look at whoops, it's a little ahead. Then there's a bunch of other things that Peter mentions too, that does things that are rash. And I just wanted to mention as an honorable mention that he's out in Galatia later on, even as an apostle and kind of the leader of the apostles at this point. And he's up in Galatia, and he's eating with the Gentiles, and he had helped Paul establish that the Gentiles needed to hear the gospel too. And then he starts seeing these Pharisees, these Judaizer types, And he says, you know what, these Gentiles are kind of gross, man. I'm going to go sit over here with my kind of people. And it got so bad that Paul said, hey, what you're doing is wrong. And he has to rebuke him to his face, right? So, I mean, Peter makes all kinds of these bad decisions. And if we think about all the things that Peter did in his entire life, we only have a little snapshot of it. Just like when we talk about Jesus and we read in the Gospels all the different things that Jesus did, all the different things that his apostles did, we only have a little snapshot. You know, we get an idea from this verse here, which I gave you a glimpse of a minute ago, John 21:25. And there are also many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, I suppose that the whole world itself would not contain the books that would be written. So there's a lot of things that happened in the world, a lot of things that happened with the apostles, with Jesus, with everybody that we don't know about, that are, you know, that we don't have preserved for us. But it's interesting, you know, to think that even though Peter made all these blatant errors or mistakes, that they're the things that got preserved in the books that we're reading, right? So if you think about, you know, Peter probably did all these other good things that could have filled up the books. They could have filled up the rest of the space that they needed to fill up, and we didn't need to mention necessarily that Peter did these wrong things, other than the fact that we can really learn a lot from them. And I think that they are they're informative for righteous living. They tell us not to make rash decisions, not to rush to action, and to listen and think about what we're going to say or what we're going to do, and to calm ourselves before we make a decision. All of the examples of Peter show me, all these negative examples that we were talking about, show me that when I make a decision, I should be thoughtful about it. I think of an ill-worded email, right? Something that maybe I put the cap locks on when I wrote it. You know, you ever get one of those? This person's really trying to make a point here. It's like they're shouting at you because the cap locks are on, right? Instead, maybe I ought to step back from my email with the cap locks on, save it as a draft, come back to it later when I'm calmer and more collected, when I've been able to pray about it, when I've been able to think about what I'm going to do. And I think in this world of social media too, man, it's so dangerous. You know, you get one misunderstood or maybe even a nasty Facebook message or whatever, and you just immediately want to like write back like, you bad person, you know, I can't believe you wrote that. You're a so-and-so, you know. And then you know what happens is, even if you delete it, it's preserved on the internet for eternity, right? So there's no escape of that. It's like, no, you must answer for this one thing that you did 20 years ago because you happened to type it in a moment of anger. So, you know, it's a dangerous thing, and it's something that we should all learn from, you know, with Peter making these rash decisions that they usually it doesn't end up well. It doesn't end up well. So instead, take time to breathe, you know, and remember that words can encourage and lift people up, but they can also hurt people's feelings. They can crush people's self-esteem. They can do a lot of damage. That our words matter, that what we say matters. And I think that just as Peter shows us some of the things that are wrong to do, that there are also lots of verses in the Bible that tell us what's helpful or what's good to do. I like this from Proverbs. Solomon writes in Proverbs 16:23 and 24, the heart of the wise instructs his mouth and adds persuasiveness to his lips. Pleasant words are a honeycomb, sweet to the soul and healing to the bones. So that sounds good, right? I mean, that's how we want to be. If you're wise, you're going to think about, your wisdom is going to instruct what your mouth says. You're not going to make this rash decision, just you know, blam, you know, like a shotgun, just blast it out there. But you're going to think about it. You're going to be wise about it. And that you're going to have pleasant words that are like a honeycomb. And you think of a honeycomb minus the bees, that's pretty appealing. And look what he says. He's like, it's like chicken soup, right? It's sweet to the soul and healing to the bones. And who doesn't like to receive like a nice little message that acknowledges something good about you or something good that you've done? It does make you feel good. It makes you feel like it's not all for naught, right? So what else does Peter's example teach us, or the things that Peter did teach us? I think it also teaches us that we need to remember to have humility, right? Peter lacked humility in a lot of ways, so much so that he even felt like it was his place to rebuke Jesus. He told Jesus, "No, man, you're wrong." And he tells him that on more than one occasion. He refuses to let him wash his feet. He's like, "No, you're wrong. You can't do that." And then he says, "Oh, you're going to die? Well, no, you're wrong. You can't do that." So he thinks he knows better than Jesus. And we are oftentimes quick to think that we are right, or that we have all the answers, when a lot of times the truth is that life isn't cookie cutter. Life isn't one size fits all, common stuff. Rather, life is full of different opportunities, different experiences that we all have. Our individual life stories are important and useful in different circumstances. We should never say things like, "You know what your problem is?" well, let me tell you what your problem is. Instead, we ought to hear people out and carefully deliberate our response, right? We should deliberate our responses. We should not be eager to show people how brilliant and amazing that we are, but rather look to the Bible, look to the Scriptures, look to God for guidance, and let God show how brilliant He is by giving us good advice that's in the Bible, right? And let that tell us how we ought to handle our troubles. And I think Solomon has got some good advice here too. It says in Proverbs 11:2, it says, "When pride comes, then comes dishonor," right? "But with the humble is wisdom." And that's true. If we're humble, then we're going to act more wise. I think, we learn a lot of how not to be in these examples from Peter, but I think that these examples from Peter can also be encouraging, right? And you're like, well, how is that encouraging? You just see this disaster happen over and over again with this guy. Well, we see that God's chosen apostles are real people, right? We see that they're real people with flaws and with strengths and weaknesses. It gives us hope and encouragement to know that even if we're out there and we fall flat on our face, just like smack right into the pavement, that we can stand up, dust ourselves off, and keep following Jesus, keep walking the path, because there's nothing that can stop you. Think about Peter. He denied Jesus, and Jesus said, "You know what? I know that you're sorry, that you repented, that you want to be with me, and that you love me." He says, "Go feed my sheep, Peter. Go feed my sheep." None of us is perfect, not even the apostles, no matter how hard we try. We do not always have the answers, and sometimes the answers that we do have come from the bargain bin and are in need of a serious upgrade, right? And that's okay, because life is about learning and growing daily in the Lord, growing in wisdom. You don't start with all of it in your brain. Peter, he made a lot of mistakes, but he also learned and he grew on the way. He was the first to recognize that Jesus was the Messiah. He delivered the first sermon introducing the gift and mercy of God through Jesus Christ at Pentecost. He was chosen by God to reveal that the Gentiles had a place in the church. All these things from the same guy that made all of those rash decisions, that God used him for many great works. And we also can make mistakes, but then learn and grow from those consequences in order to do great work for God, that He can use us for great things too. So today, we talked about how our decisions have consequences, both good and bad. We talked about scriptures, namely the life of Peter, and how they can teach us a lot about what decision making should be, how we should be thoughtful, how we should be humble. That if we make a mistake, that our life is not over, that we can find encouragement from examples like Peter, and that we can continue to grow and learn from God in our life with Him, walking together with Him. So before we close our discussion about decision making today, I want to ask you if you made what is probably the most important decision of your life. Have you decided to let Jesus be your personal Savior? Have you heard God's word? Do you believe in Jesus Christ? Have you asked for forgiveness of the mistakes that you've made? Have you been baptized into Jesus Christ? Those are all decisions that we have to make, and decisions with real consequences. And if you haven't made those decisions, ask yourself why. Why have I not decided to follow Jesus? And I guess that's where I want to leave it. If there's anything on your heart today that you need to say or do, I hope that you feel comfortable doing that as we stand and we sing our closing song. Thank you.